The Magic Voice by Madeleine Collier. Her Majesty Queen Dulcie Duck was very worried about her ducklings, very worried indeed. It was really quite bad enough, she quacked to her husband, the king, that they should lay their eggs in the pond and not in their schoolroom. But it was getting quite beyond a joke when they refused to come home at night until it was quite dark. In Duckland, everyone is bound to be in at dusk. It is a very strict rule, and a very wise one too. For sly Mr. Fox comes out after dusk, on the lookout for a nice plump duckling. And every night lately, they had been coming home late, and every night she was so afraid that they wouldn't come home at all. King Webfoot Duck didn't bother himself at all. He said, "Let them alone and they'll come home like Bo-Peep sheep." But that wouldn't content the Queen, and she set off that very day with a bag of fly sandwiches under her arm to try to discover what became of them every night. She hadn't gone very far before she met the furry caterpillar, and she asked him whether he had seen any of her ducklings, and he said no. He was glad to say he had not. It wasn't a very polite answer to a queen, but then you see, caterpillars don't like ducks very much. After that, she met the worm school, all wriggling along two and two, and they looked sideways at her and answered very politely when she spoke to them and said they hadn't seen the ducklings for days. Queen Dulcie didn't eat worms because she was a queen, but they never felt quite safe with her. She passed the Violets' house, and when she asked them, they giggled into their leaves. But as they were too shy to answer, she passed on. At last she came to the place where the roads divide into the twirly-whirly road and the straight road. Now the straight road said to her, "Come up here, Queen Dulcie, and I will take you on, and you won't have to turn a single corner." But Queen Dulcie said, "Do you know where my ducklings are, Mr. Road? Because if you don't, it's not a bit of use my going on with you in a straight line, for they may be hiding around a corner." Then Mr. Road got rather angry, and he said, "I haven't got the slightest idea where your ducklings are," and he stretched himself out straighter than ever. Then she turned to the twirly-whirly road, which wound round and round, and in and out, and up and down, and here and there, and she said, "Oh, twirly-whirly road, have you seen my ducklings?" And the twirly-whirly road said, "Yes, I have," and it chuckled himself. "Oh yes, Queen Dulcie," it said, "I've seen them, and if you will follow me, I will lead you up and down and round and show you where they are." "Oh, thank you," cried Queen Dulcie, and she bustled off after the road, and it curled and twisted and climbed and dipped and led her up hill and down dale and around corners until she was quite tired. "Is it very much further now, Twirly-Whirly Road?" she asked. "Not very far now," said the road. "We're nearly there." At last they came to the great wood, where all the fairy creatures live, and the Twirly-Whirly Road said, "I can't come any further or I shall get lost. Keep straight ahead until you come to the gnome's house, and he will tell you where your ducklings are." So the Queen kept straight ahead. The wood seemed full of little people, along the same way as herself. Where can they all be going? She wondered. At last she came to an opening in the trees, and then she stood still and quacked in surprise. There was the gnome's house at the foot of an old oak tree, and sitting in front of it was a little old gnome dressed all in red with a long white beard. He held a long wand in his hand, and he was calling out in a thin piping voice, come along, friends, walk in, bring your mothers, fathers, sons, daughters and babies, walk in and hear the wonderful magical voice." From every side they came hurrying, furry folk, feathered folk, fairy folk, running, flying or crawling, and they all disappeared into a large wooden hut next door to the oak tree. Just then the old gnome caught sight of the Queen. "Aha, your Majesty!" he cried. "Have you too come to hear the magic voice?" And when he said, "Your Majesty," all the little folk bowed low to the ground and cried out in a chorus, "Welcome, your Majesty." "What is the magic voice?" asked the Queen. "I've come to find my ducklings." "Aha," said the gnome. "You'll find them in there, sure enough." And because Queen Dulcie Duck was the first queen who had visited the hut, except the fairy queen, the The tiny folk of the wood formed a procession, and solemnly, 2 and 2, they entered the hut, Her Majesty leading the way. It was a very large hut inside, or so it seemed to the Queen, and it was absolutely packed with little people. There was a large table in the middle of the floor, and it was packed with little fairies and gnomes, sitting side by side, their knees drawn up under their chins. The chairs were full of furry folk, and a little grasshopper was sitting on an ink bottle. The ruler, pencils, and pens were occupied by rows of little flies. Every tiny space was filled, and when Queen Dulcie and her little procession came in, there was no room for more. As she passed into the hut, she heard a voice say, "Now I will tell you a story about a greedy little centipede who hung up all his stockings on Christmas Eve, and Father Christmas just put a tiny stone in every one to punish him." Then the Queen spotted her lost ducklings, standing in a long row, not far away, listening with all their ears. She pushed her way through the crowd towards them, and everyone bowed as she passed. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked sternly. "What are you doing here?" Then suddenly she discovered that although the voice was still speaking, telling the story of the little centipede, everyone in the room was listening, no one was speaking. "Who is telling that story?" she asked. "The magic voice," said one of the little ducklings. "Isn't it wonderful? It's coming out of the air. We come and listen to it every night. All the wood folk do. It tells us such lovely stories." The Queen's beak dropped open in surprise. A voice coming from nowhere. She didn't speak again until it had finished. Then she collected all her little ducklings and went towards the door. "Please, Mr. Gnome," she said as she went out, "where does that magic voice come from?" But Mr. Gnome said, "Your Majesty, I don't know. It's a magic voice, and it comes out of the air, and every night at this time it tells us a little story about our folk. I heard it one night as I was going home, and I'm an old gnome now and can't work much, so I thought I'd make an honest acorn or two by turning this little place into a magic theatre. There's no harm in it, is there?" "None at all," said Queen Dulcie, "and I hope you'll do very well. I shall always come myself in future." And she did. And what is more, she brought the king with her. And nobody knew that the magic voice was really a wireless set, which belonged to an author who lived in the wood and used that little hut to write it. They didn't know that when the children's hour started, he went home just over the fence to have his supper with his wife, and he didn't know, when he came back later, that ever so many little folk had been listening in and had gone home to bed when the grown-ups part of the program began. And you don't know how many of your dollies and toys listen in if you leave the wireless talking away in the children's hour while you're not in the